Hello, my name is Adgar and I'm the leader of the Adaptation Research Programme at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at UEA, the University of East Anglia here in the UK. I'd like to talk to you I'd like to make 3 points about the science of climate change, about some worst case scenarios around climate change, and about the challenges that poses for ActionAid and for other organisations. First of all, the science. The science of climate change alarms me every time I read a new scientific paper, but the science is extremely well established. The important points for your organisation are that the impacts of climate change are already upon us. Scientifically rigorous methods can detect and have actually now begun to observe climate change as it would be defined, actual climatic changes imposed on us by anthropogenic forces, by human action, in all sorts of areas, primarily in ecosystems and in changes in what is known as the cryosphere, in ice, in glaciers around the world. Of course, most of these observations are where scientists tend to look, so they tend to be in Europe and North America elsewhere. But clearly these changes in the climate are happening all around the globe, even if the main scientific observations are going on in places where the scientists are. Given these impacts that are already upon us, there are adaptations going on now to observed climate changes and also to expected climate changes in the future. The government of China are extremely concerned about these impacts and are acting through their central planning ministries, particularly in agriculture, to plan for some demographic shifts around climate change impacts on agriculture. In Nepal, the government is thinking about and planning to drain glacial lakes to stop outburst flooding that has occurred in the past and is likely to occur more with potential impacts of climate change on glacier runoff. In various other countries in the Pacific Islands, there are community initiatives to try to the word is sometimes used as climate proof, but to try to reduce the impacts of increasing intensity of hurricanes and typhoons in the Pacific Islands on local communities. So there's all sorts of adaptations already taking place. So the science is well established and the adaptations are already taking place. Now, I believe that organisations like ActionAid should really focus on worst case scenarios. And by worst case scenarios, these are not scenarios, these are not impacts of climate change that are unlikely. Let me say that right at the outset. The worst case scenarios are equally likely as best case scenarios, in my opinion, in climate change. The reason for that is that the worst case scenarios are likely to occur if main polluting countries in the world don't reduce their emissions. And let's face it, there isn't a great deal of action that would actually suggest that. The worst case scenarios will also occur if there's unchecked demographic changes towards aging, but also impacts of HIV and other pandemics in vulnerable populations around the world. And the worst case scenarios will also be tied up with not being able to anticipate these risks of climate change. So worst case scenarios are as equally likely as best case scenarios whenever it comes to the impacts of climate change. What are these worst case scenarios? Well, I think that climate change really has the potential to undermine the Millennium Development Goals in the long run if it goes unchecked in these worst case scenarios. I think scarcity of water is actually going to be the primary driver of much demographic shift due to the unprofitability, but also the infeasibility of agriculture in many dryland areas in Asia and in Africa in particular. I think women and children are going to be particularly at risk from increased incidence of extreme events. Women and children clearly are always at risk from all sorts of natural catastrophes, and I think this trend will exacerbate and continue. In the last 30 years, the World Health Organization has identified 30 new emerging diseases, and there's no reason why this trend won't continue and may even continue at an increased rate given some of the potential impacts and the process interactions with climate parameters. So all in all, there are some pretty bleak futures in terms of development in the most vulnerable places in the world, brought about by some rather subtle interactions and some not so subtle interactions with climate change. All in all, I believe these worst-case scenarios, certainly over the next 50 years or so, do point to some rather significant demographic shifts in the world. And this, I think, represents a real challenge. Adaptation policies can help to facilitate some of these demographic shifts that are absolutely inevitable. It's a move towards coasts. It's an increase in if there even can be an increase in the rate of rural to urban migration in many developing countries. If some of this adaptation is unplanned, my guess is that this will lead to quite a lot of displacement, not necessarily what we would call refugees, but what UNHCR categorises as other people of concern. So there may well be many, many, many other people of concern, displaced people as a result of climate change if adaptation doesn't take place. This clearly poses some major challenges to Action Aid, I believe. I think these are threefold. First of all, Action Aid needs to be able to identify how to build general resilience in the most vulnerable communities in the world. And I think some specific information on the types of risk, particularly to water resources and water stress, and how these exacerbate already some critical water quality and water availability issues in particular regions is important. But also some of these specific emerging diseases and potential health risks, for example, around malaria. Now, adaptation to climate change is not rocket science. The technologies are there, and Action Aid and other development organisations can be at the forefront of actually implementing and stemming the worst potential impacts of climate change. Secondly, I think Action Aid needs to engage in a very politically sensitive area around this area of demographic shift and the potential for environmental refugees. I don't think the term environmental refugees is the correct one, but I don't think other people of concern is either. So I think Action Aid has a real challenge to engage policymakers in developing countries, overseas development assistance agencies, and the general public to actually come to terms with some potential very significant demographic shifts that are likely in the developing world, and actually to focus on that as some of the major impacts of climate change. A third challenge, I think, is not to sensationalize climate change. Clearly, climate change is a creeping problem. It will exacerbate some things that you already have to deal with, and I would certainly urge you not to try and sensationalize it. It's simply a further injustice being heaped on the developing world, I think, than in continuing some past injustices for all sorts of reasons. So I wish you simply the best of luck in your deliberations, and I can say as a scientist that the scientific world needs the advocacy and the leadership of civil society organisations like yourselves to really take forward this challenge in this and interrelated affairs going into the future. I certainly hope this isn't the end of development. Thank you.